This is the Commodore Amiga. Or, well, not this. This is the Commodore Amiga video that I've been promising I was going to make for ages. Because, you know, I've just not got around to it.
The Amiga from Commodore offers fun, games and education for the whole family. The Amiga from Commodore, at your local dealer now.
This is the Commodore Amiga, all the way from Sunderland. So of course what I should be saying realistically is this is my Commodore Amiga. My favourite computer. This thing here. It's a bit of a beast. I mean, it's big, as you can see. At the time, it wasn't that big really. It was bigger than a games console, of course, but it didn't seem like that bad. I had a special computer desk for it, next to a TV. I had some hi-fi speakers above it. It was a nice setup. Now, I got this thing in the late 80s, I think 89, somewhere around 88, 89, something like that, when I was about 20 years old. Now, it didn't have the greatest of lifespans, I must admit. I say that, I mean, I suppose for computer systems it would do, but for gaming systems probably not. This thing I had for a while, then I got a girlfriend in 92, and I had a lot more interesting things to do with the girlfriend than I did with the computers. Computers sort of went out the window a bit, and I had more things to go to the pub and places like that and spend time with my girlfriend. We did play some games together on it, but by the end, by about 95, it had stopped getting used. If you watch the video about my computing history, or my specific, I had a BBC, a Spectrum, an Amstrad CPC just before the Amiga, then the Amiga. Directly after the Amiga, I got my first Mac, a big tower Mac, and eventually a PlayStation, the PlayStation 1 when it first came out. So that was for gaming. The computer, the Mac, was doing all 3D stuff, photos, and more serious stuff, as I saw it. Stuff you could have done with this, and some of the stuff I did do with this. This was multi-talented for me. I did do games on it as well though, and we'll have a go and play with all of that lot. It's fairly big, but fairly nondescript. It's got an expansion port over this side, which I'll get to a little bit later. It's got an expansion port underneath with a bit of sellotape on it. This is where the memory goes. So this computer comes with 512 kilobytes of memory, so 512K. There's an expansion board in the bottom for another 512, so it makes it a 1 megabyte machine. Whoopie-doo. We've got a floppy disk drive on the side, and then a series of ports on the back, peripheral ports, things for printers, other drives, 2 ports to plug in a mouse and a joystick, and audio out ports, which I said I had speakers on my wall through a hi-fi system for an amp, and the sound out of this thing's absolutely brilliant. At the time it was like nothing like it. It was amazing because it's got a dedicated sound chip. Same in its graphics, it has a dedicated graphics chip, a dedicated processor. Everything was dedicated in this, which meant it was slightly better than the other machines which are beeping and bopping and making MIDI sounds, but not PCM audio sounds, which this one was doing. One thing you will notice on this though, there isn't an on and off button on it, or even a reset button. The on and off button's actually on the power supply, and boy is that a power supply. It's a monster. The box was a heavy box getting it out of the loft, mainly because of this bugger. This is the power supply. Rattles, it's not as much, it doesn't take up as much space in there as it should do. You get loads of lead, and you get your on and off switch on the side here. But this always used to sit next to the computer on the floor, so you leant down and switched it on and off when you needed to. You also got in the box a modulator to connect it to your monitor or TV. So to go to a TV, you had an RF adapter. So this thing plugs in the back of the computer through one of the ports, then it connects to your TV, and you've got audio outs on the side. So you used an ordinary TV aerial to connect it, which I didn't like the idea of, but initially when I first got it, that's all I could use. SCARTs and things like that didn't actually exist when I first got it. Later on they did, and I upgraded my TV to a Sony flat screen, still a CRT, but a flat CRT, slightly curved, and that had a SCART socket on the back of it, which meant I could then get the lead to go from the Amiga to the SCART, which was a much better connection. The other thing, and the most important thing, and the first time I had anything like it, the mouse. Actually got a 2-button with a ball mouse. Serial mouse, which is what they were at the time, but very few other machines, definitely no home machines other than Atari ST, used a mouse. All your Spectrums and your Commodore 64s and everything else, they were using keyboards, and mouse was a new and rather wonderful design. As I said, you can get it on the Atari ST. The early Macintosh had a mouse with a single button, but they were still, like, you know, even in the 80s, mid 80s, they were probably still £6,000 or £7,000. Ridiculously expensive, and they were black and white. The other thing though I had in my box is a disk drive. I had an extra disk drive because it just made life easier, because that computer on its own, when the computer switched on, there's no operating system, there's nothing. You switch the computer on, literally nothing. It just comes up with a symbol saying workbench, put a disk in it. There is no built-in operating system of any kind whatsoever. So if you switch it on, it does nothing. So you had to load everything. Now if you loaded stuff, you loaded it via disk. And then sometimes you'd need to load your operating system first, so your workbench, which was your desktop, load your desktop and then put your disk in to load your other stuff. So having 2 disk drives just made life easier. For one reason. Some of the programs you get came on more than one disk, because disks only held around 720 to 800k. As I said, the machine's a 1 megabyte machine, but data comes on and off the disk. The more modern disks you remember using with early PCs, if you've ever used Windows 95 and Windows before that, you were using 1.4 megabyte disks, floppy disks. This was using, and the Atari were using 720 to 800k discs. Ridiculously low. Stupidly low. I mean, you couldn't even get a quarter of a single photograph from a camera or from a phone on there nowadays. I did say that the Amiga didn't come with an operating system other than on a floppy disk, and it didn't come with any drive system, so therefore you had disks for everything. Which means this basically was your life. You had everything on discs, and you had to have somewhere to put them, which meant stacking them up somewhere, finding as many things as you could to store this stuff on, because you couldn't store it on your computer. Now there is an expansion port on the side of the Amiga. Here is an expansion port. This is where you would put accelerators, graphics accelerators, extra memory when you was really going up in memory to like 4 meg or something, which was really expensive, and your hard drive. And again, your hard drives came out later. It didn't come out initially, but later on you can get a hard drive for it. It would be a 20 megabyte hard drive, which is roughly about 20 of your discs, just over maybe. For the money, it was about 500-600 quid for the hard drive. I never really saw the point, because you wasn't getting a lot on it until you got to the later ones. So this, guys, is the Amiga setup. The mouse over here, the computer, my extra drive, a standing TV to use as a monitor. Amiga did sell a monitor for a stupid amount of money, but I never wanted one. So you'd had a little TV at the time. It wasn't a FST like this. It would have been an ordinary CRT TV. And over there is your power supply, which you click on. And it does that. As I said, no operating system, but it's doing something. So I stick in the workbench disk and wait a little while. Now again, like the computers beforehand, you had things like the Spectrums and the Commodores. They used to run off of tapes. You used to have to wait for the tapes to load. This is better than that, trust me, luckily. So the calendar and the date's completely out, which I expected, because the computers are very, very old computers now. You'd kind of expect the calendar to be wrong, because the computer's 34 years old. And for probably 30 years it's been in the loft, or at least 28 years it's been in the loft. So this is your operating system and your desktop. This, with your mouse, left button does what you expect it to do on any other one. Double click it, you have a window, and you have icons. Can we set the clock to something a bit more modern? Okay, so this is the sort of setup screen as such, like your control panel as such for your Amiga preferences. And this allows us to adjust the date. let's see. Oh no, we can actually set it to this clock, which is quite handy. By the way, I'm wearing my dad's watch. It's an old Seiko watch. When I was doing a video for the Pulsar, I found some bits, i.e. extra strap links, because this never really fit me. It was always a bit too tight. But I found the extra links and now I can make it fit, which is quite handy. Now, the reason for the second drive, to run something else on the desktop at the same time. So I plug in this, and then you get a second disk over here. So you close this one, or close the windows for now. So with another disk in, you could do things like utilities and other things. Okay, so this allowed you to read stuff off of your disk drives. So you could go through your stuff, read your stuff, see your stuff, use your stuff, do whatever you wanted to do. Now a lot of these disks though would run on their own, and that's the one thing with the Amiga. You didn't have to run the Workbench for everything. The Workbench was brilliant, useful, but you could run stuff directly without need of the Workbench, which is why you didn't have an operating system. Now a good thing also with this is you didn't have to eject disks, i.e. there's nothing on the screen to go on here to eject a disk in any way. You just literally take it out and they will eventually disappear. There you go. Now the Amiga had brilliant sound. As I said when I used it previously, when I actually had the computer set up, I used to have it connected to a hi-fi. At the moment it's got a couple of outputs here that go to the TV. I'm not quite sure how good the TV sound is. So let's see if we can find anything to load. Now one of the things you can see over here, if you look at the mouse, you've actually got loads of different drives. So if you did have a hard drive fitted to it as well, and then the hard drives, remember, is only about 20 megabytes, which isn't a lot considering you had nearly 1 megabyte on a disk, so 20 disks on one hard drive. You could load stuff via the extra drives here, and you'd actually get some proper, and I love this tune, one of my favourite tunes ever for a computer. Takes a little while to load, but whilst it's loading you'll notice that the little mouse pointer changes colour. This is just one of the versions of the music tracking software. Now of course the beauty of this is you can actually play these instruments yourself. So the whole idea with this software was you could actually write and produce your own music. This is just to show you another side of what the computer did back then and what it was capable of. So yeah, it looks a bit naff today, doesn't it? But this is 1989. And at the time you'd come from the Spectrum with its 8-bit colours, and this was actually something quite amazing. And the other thing is the processor's actually processing this in real time. It's not a video you're watching, as you would say nowadays on YouTube and stuff like that. This is actually processing, the computer's computing all of these angles and shadings and everything now as it's doing it. Although it's fully rendered beforehand, but it's still quite unique. So yes, I'm still on the boring stuff and still loading the boring stuff, but this is what sort of some of us used it for originally and what it was better at than anything else at the time. 3D pictures created by my mate. What else have we got? Yep, typical Arnie. Had to be, hadn't it? But that was, you could paint that if you knew what you were doing and you was good at it. Or you could create 3D images, and the 3D images was the best bit because you could create your 3D images using other software like Sculpt 3D or Real 3D, and they were the real fun and enjoyable things to use. Funny the strange things you find, as I said, in our youth. There was me and the girlfriend at the time that basically ended up stopped using the computer because of. I didn't really draw much, as you can see. I did make some demos, but the demo maker program isn't working at the moment, which unfortunately isn't any good because I wanted to show you that. Yay, Froggy. Great fun. Now, of course, you didn't just get discs that you bought yourself or you sent away for. You got discs off of magazines, lots of magazines, and the magazines at the time, Amiga format and all the other type of magazines, gave away discs, always gave away discs. On the front of the magazine, you'd have 1 or 2 discs, and you'd have something like this with something maybe useful, maybe not. Sometimes it'd even be games. Yeah, not every disc had anything of any real use. Oh, kid colour. Very basic program for kids. Yep, very, very basic. Anyway. Amazing. Not. Now, of course, you didn't come here just to see utilities and drawing and music and all that kind of crap, did you? The big thing the Amiga sold for, the big thing that made it sell, and which is what it got used to, which also is its downfall, really, to be perfectly honest with you, because it was trying to be sold as a serious computer and to get people into computing and to learn something and stuff like that. And then it was used 90% for gaming. But it can't be said the gaming's bloody good. I used to love playing this. Now, this game got an awful lot of use from me and my girlfriend at the time when we played it. It was amazing. Oh man, didn't even start. As you can see, the only thing you needed to play it was your keyboard. Now, one of the things you need to talk about when it comes to games is these joysticks, serial joysticks. The old Atari style joystick, slightly more controlled button joystick, or if you was really into it and you really wanted to go down that flight sim route, which I did, you would have like a flight controller joystick. But these did what everything else did. You had 2 ports on the back of the machine, as you remember. One port is for the mouse, the other port is for your joystick. If you wanted to play a 2-player game, you unplugged the mouse because you only had the 2 inputs, which is what most games consoles had for a while. Having a joystick allowed me to move and do stuff that was not easy in some of these games, because some of these games actually they made them really hard for no apparent reason. It wasn't like the million goes you get nowadays. Then it's been about 30 odd years since I've played it, and you've only got one button. That's the downside to this. You've got one button on the controller to play with, which wasn't as not as wonderful as you'd expect. Gaming wise, at the time, it wasn't too bad. Back then. Some of the stuff you got on it was stuff you'd seen before from other games, other consoles, and maybe even the arcade. Kids don't know the hardship nowadays of playing with a joystick rather than a controller. Now, back in the day when it was popular, there was also a lot of sim type games or god games. They became quite popular on this. Things like SimCity came out on this in the Atari initially. And some of those games, things like this is called Megalomania. There you go, god type games. And there was loads of these. I can't remember if I ever played them or not, or what I did with them, or how I did it, or where I did it. So, what's going to happen to it? Well, it's going to end up going back in the loft, isn't it? I can't think of any usage for it today in the modern world, unless you wanted to sit and write music on stuff like this. The drawing's not very good, the games are okay, but they're not brilliant because you're using one button on the joystick. Of its time, it was a brilliant system. But I never upgraded to the later Amigas, the 500 plus, the 600, the 1200 and so on. I should have got the 1200 because the 1200 was compatible with DOS discs, which meant I could have transferred stuff back onto it now, or from it. Like these music discs I've got here, I can't play them in anything else because they only work in the Amiga, because they're only in an Amiga style format on the disc, and you can't convert them or use anything else to run them, unless you had an Amiga 1200. So it's going to go back in the loft. For now, one day if I set up an enormous games room with my Xboxes, PlayStations, Dreamcast, Mega Drive, Switch and the other stuff, maybe it would come out as a game system, like a retro system, but said they're not that fun using one button.